A cursory review of best-selling novels over the last several decades can fill a writer of literary fiction with existential angst. Novels belonging to genres such as mystery, romance, and horror abound. Meanwhile, literary fiction is all but absent from the bestsellers list. A writer of serious fiction wonders, is this inevitable, the reading public's overwhelming preference for the formulaic, the familiar, the soon forgotten? Back around 1800, Jeremy Bentham, the father of utilitarianism, said famously, "The quality of pleasure being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry." Now, pushpin was a kind of bowling at the time, and poetry was as highly regarded then as it is now. What he was saying, of course, is that more erudite pursuits, such as poetry, are no better than the more mundane things like bowling. They simply should be measured by the amount of pleasure. There's a certain level of pretentiousness inherent in the phrase literary fiction. But what specifically delineates literary fiction from the rest is a matter of some dispute among academics and book critics alike. One would think an obvious marker of work of high literary value would be its having won an important prize for fiction. But as Judith Shulevitz of the New York Times put it, the Pulitzer Prize Committee is notorious for immortalizing writers of perishable reputation. As we've seen with the furor surrounding The Goldfinch, which won the Pulitzer in 2014, literary prizes do not necessarily win the approval of the literati. Consequently, it's difficult to declare with any expectation of unanimity that a given work is of high literary value. I expect you'll disagree with my specific choices, but bear with me and see if these criteria support the books that you deem highly literary. Things aren't always as bleak as they might seem, though. Here's a bestsellers list from the New York Times, dated April 2008. And that was actually a pretty auspicious day for literary fiction on the bestsellers list. We had a book by Jodi Picoult, who's considered a highly literary writer. Khalid Hosseini, of course. The Other Boleyn Girl was I think, a work of literary fiction. Most people would agree. There's also The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and a book by Anne Enright, who had won the Man Booker Prize the year before. So let's talk about some of the hallmarks of literary fiction. Some of the common things you'll find are the language, the use of language. It's often the vocabulary is elevated, the language is figurative. Sometimes there's a unique approach with regard to language. And then there's characterization. The depth of the main characters in a novel of literary fiction really often can't be compared to the depth of characters in, say, a mystery novel. Characterization is sort of at the heart of the good work of literary fiction. Another characters will vary, of course, from stereotype, or if they are sort of stereotyped people, as often is the case, they have some stereotypical sort of hallmarks. Then the book will play with that. And then when it comes to characterization, there's a certain specificity of experience that writers of literary fiction are particularly good at expressing and getting the reader to identify with. Literary fiction is also often hallmarked by unique approaches, it's a completely different way of telling the story, non-chronologically, or maybe varying the narrator or the point of view. And often they'll break genre conventions. Also theme in a literary novel, the theme is often of wider scope. It's often deeply entrenched in the plot. It often is the driving force of the book. So there are many hallmarks that are sort of specific to a work of literary fiction. So some of the common elements of all bestsellers include great beginnings, of course, dramatic questions, compelling characters. Often they're of a known convention or genre. Information gaps, according to the psychology of interest. Information gaps are what evoke a person's curiosity, and satisfying ending. Now, literary bestsellers tend to also have, more complex characters. They twist conventions. The themes are often sort of entrenched in story and plot, and they often are more meaty, more profound themes. And then another common element of bestsellers is a surprise ending, which seemed to come up over and over again as I examined the different books. Let's start at the beginning, because the single most important element of a novel aiming for the bestsellers list is an attention-grabbing start. The story must begin in a way that is immediately gratifying to readers, that hooks their interest, piques their curiosity, arouses their empathy. The pragmatic reason for the primacy of this factor in a book's success is that the sheer volume of fiction produced every year results in a publishing industry eager to quickly differentiate a book that is viable from one that is not. Quite simply, without a riveting beginning, there will be no publishing deal. As our own Sterling Watson says, every good story starts with because. That is, because something has already happened, the first action of the novel happens now. Something we are told or something that is implied happened before the action of the first page. The thing that happened before the story begins a chain of cause and effect, a chain that runs from the beginning of the novel to the end. So speaking of great beginnings, here are three. From Jodi Picoult's The Reader. On the second Thursday of the month, Ms. Dombrowski brings her dead husband to our therapy group. Here's another, Donna Tartt, who wrote The Secret History. The snow in the mountains was melting, and Bunny had been dead for several weeks before we came to understand the gravity of our situation. Another great beginning. I was born twice. First as a baby girl on a remarkably smogless Detroit day of January 1960, and then again as a teenage boy in an emergency room near Pulaski, Michigan. And that's, of course, Jeffrey Eugenides, his Middlesex. And these are all great beginnings. There are themes of death and rebirth. There's humor. There's a dramatic question. So there's suspense in the form of the ticking time bomb of the snow melting in the mountains. These beginnings, whether they're literary or otherwise, they have it all. For a great literary beginning, the opening paragraphs of Kiran Desai's The Inheritance of Loss is a great example. This beginning breaks many of the rules of the blockbuster bestseller. There's very little happening in the story. In fact, it doesn't seem much has happened. There's no hook, no interesting character, no hitting the ground running. In fact, there's very little for the reader to sink her teeth into. It's all description. But for the literary reader, it's also a treat. In most cases, the dramatic question is the central, cohesive source of tension in the work. As John Le Carré put it, the cat sat on the mat is not the beginning of a story, but the cat sat on the dog's mat is. In his simple example, Le Carré establishes the dramatic question, will the dog kill the cat? The dramatic question, whether it's a single central question or a series of questions leading one from the next, as James W. Hall put it, we are drawn forward by the momentum of the unfolding story. James W. Hall wrote, of course, Hit Lit, which examined these very issues I'm dwelling on. The dramatic question doesn't have to be particularly profound. Kurt Vonnegut has a great story about a student of his. She'd written a story about a nun who had a piece of dental floss stuck in her teeth. Although the story addressed many issues, the dramatic question seemed to be, when will she dislodge the damned dental floss? There are many different kinds of dramatic questions. Our own Sterling Watson describes the power of the central dramatic question that is no more than two characters joined by a verb. Will Hamlet kill Claudius? Will the vampire drink the blood of his interviewer? Sue Monk Kidd's Invention of Wings asks, will Hetty break free of slavery? Every mystery ever written asks, how will Hercule Poirot, Ms. Marple, Nancy Drew solve the crime? And again, there's always the mundane. Will that poor nun manage to remove the damned dental floss from her molars? The single most important element of any story is its characters. Book people, as Janet Broway calls them. Bestsellers, while not necessarily character-driven, must be peopled with characters sufficiently compelling to coax readers into an ongoing, perhaps contentious, relationship with them. Characters can be lions, witches, or wardrobes, but to readers, they are people. Of the ever-popular Bugs Bunny, Burroway says, "Isn't a rabbit, he's a plucky youth in ears." Research into the psychology of interest finds a strong connection, starting from childhood, between a reader's character identification, that is, his or her similarity to the characters in a story, and that reader's interest in the story. It stands to reason that the richer, the more fully human the character, the greater any reader's identification will be to that character. While compelling characters are a key to any good story, there are differences between the way they're handled in literary fiction and fiction of the other sort. Typically in literary fiction, the characters are more complex. They resemble our many-layered selves, as Jonathan Penner describes them. They tend to be introduced in an artful way. There's no gazing at themselves in the mirror and describing their own eyes. Popular fiction tends to have more extreme or stereotypical characters, the bad guy versus the good guy. Characters are often plot devices as well, or cliches. Mystery novels, for example, depend on the cop with the incredible powers of deduction and perhaps a shallow inner life. One of the most compelling characters in my recent memory was Handful, the heart-wrenchingly brave slave girl in Sumonk Kid's invention of wings. We get to know Handful rather well in the following short passage. "There was a time in Africa the people could fly. Mama told me this one night when I was 10 years old. My mama was shrewd. She didn't get any reading and writing like me. Everything she knew came from living on the scarce side of mercy. She looked at my face, how it flowed with sorrow and doubt, and she said, 'You don't believe me? Where do you think those shoulder blades of yours come from, girl?' I was shrewd like Mama. Even at 10, I knew the story about people flying was pure malarkey. We weren't some special people who lost our magic. We were slave people, and we weren't getting anywhere. It was later I saw what she meant. We could fly all right, but there wasn't any magic to it." From this we learn that Handful is shrewd because she tells us so, but it's also clear that by the age of 10, she's a staunch cynic. Unlike most children with whom readers are likely to be familiar, Handful doesn't believe in mercy, much less this malarkey about people flying. At 10 years old, she is simply flowing with sorrow and doubt. If Handful is going to fly, it's going to take a lot more than just magic.